If you've been watching my content, then you know I am a huge fantasy nerd, but I still really love sci-fi. The main reason I don't paint as many sci-fi models as fantasy is because, well, I don't find a lot that interests me. I find painting machines and spacesuits kind of boring compared to, well, skin and fabric and fur and other organic materials. So when I do paint sci-fi, I look for those models that have the qualities that I enjoy to paint. With that being said, I find it extremely valuable to paint outside of your comfort zone in order to grow as an artist. And a great way to start is to find models that have a good balance of what you enjoy painting and a little bit of what scares you. I'm going to use Moloch here from the new game Grave Trigger by Cardboard Dynamo to explain what I mean. Before I get into that, I do want to mention I was surprised by how flexible yet durable this material is. It's a PVC resin hybrid. Usually, durability comes at a cost, but there seems to be no loss of detail on these models. And a big thank you to this video's sponsor, Cardboard Dynamo. If you are looking for a biopunk, horror, skirmish, and campaign game, then let me introduce you to Grave Trigger. Grave Trigger is an apocalyptic sci-fi game that takes place in a world grotesquely mutilated by humanity, where resources are rare and reclaiming technology is the difference between life and death. These models offer a good mix of machine and monster, also coming with multiple customizable weapon options that you can choose from or magnetize and swap out willingly. Get ready to engage in Fast and the Furious skirmish games, 1v1 duels, solo and co-op teams, and even epic campaign options. Grave Trigger offers the flexibility of player count and game modes, making it one of the first skirmish games to truly support a multiplayer experience. Did I also mention this game has open movement and diceless combat? Warp across the battlefield, leap off buildings in a dramatic aerial attack, even hurl terrain at your targets. Why? Because everything is a weapon. Grave Trigger is live on Kickstarter. And if you want to get a taste for how this is played, you can download the Early Access Rulebook on their Kickstarter page for free. Check out the link in the description below. Now let's get to the painting. Using my airbrush, I primed this model in black, and then I went over it with dark plum. Then hit it with some rusty brown color, Bloodstone, from the front and top. I have been really enjoying deep purples with warm browns together lately. Starting off with an airbrush base blend really helps speed up the process. But if you don't have an airbrush, you can do the same thing with just wet blending instead. Let's start with the part I'm comfortable with, the muscle tissue. I love painting flesh, and if you have a model you are hesitant to paint, beginning with those more familiar parts help you start off your painting process on a more positive note. I'm simply taking the Bloodstone, thinning it down a little and covering all the raised areas. Then going back with full opacity over top in smaller parts. I mixed a little bit of the Bloodstone with yellow ochre to work up the highlights. I want this to look creepy and dramatic, so I'm keeping my shadows dark and heavy, and then building up my midtones and highlights closer together. If you aren't edge highlighting by tilting your brush at an angle and running it across the edges, I highly suggest trying this out instead of trying to pencil something in with the tip. As the paint starts to thin as it's running out, I use this to smooth the highlights into the midtone. I'll do another pass with the yellow ochre for the final highlights on the skin. Moving on to the rest of the model, I'm going over the armored areas and mouth with a quick coat of plum. Using dark plum, holly berry, and bone, I'm mixing a gradient on my wet palette to work with to layer up the mouth areas and helmet. Each layer is smaller than the next until I'm just dotting. For the teeth, I'm mixing the bone with the dark plum and working it up the same way. Now it's time for the part that scares me a little. While this model is obviously more meat than metal, which makes it less intimidating for me, it gives me a good chance to practice something, well, that scares me, and that is non-metallic metal. Usually, the only time I enjoy painting metal is when I get to make it grungy and weather it all up, in which case I use true metallics. And I could do that here, but then that defeats the purpose of the entire video because I'm not doing something that scares me. It has taken my brain so much longer to grasp non-metallic metal than any other painting technique, and I don't know why that is. But I know I'm not alone in this. In order to break down those walls and stop being so hesitant to try this, I found a way to trick my brain into thinking I'm not doing non-metallic metal when I actually am. What? If you are intimidated by a painting technique, then you subconsciously are already psyching yourself out before you even start painting. You have to undo your mind and find a way to associate that painting technique with a good feeling instead. And for me, I love playing with color. So, a way I've found to trick my brain into accepting non metallic metal is to paint colored metals. It sounds simple, right? I'm using Plum to mark all the highlighted areas and edges before I wet blend the dark plum into it. By using non-traditional colors for metal, I'm focusing more on the blending and highlighting to create a stylistic metallic rather than the picture-perfect idea of metal. This allows me to let go of the worry of perfection and embrace a more creative approach. Another reason why I love the make-believe. In an unrealistic world, there are no rules. Next step was to go over it again with the plum. I really like the look of purple highlighted with pale blue, so I mixed a little bit of the plum into a faded ultramarine for the highlights. For the final round of highlights, I mixed a little bit of white into the faded ultramarine and went around dotting the brightest points. I could have went through and dotted those brightest points with just straight white, but I did want a dark atmosphere and not so shiny and reflective. To finish up the model, I created a wash from a drop of black ink, sepia ink, and dark plum paint. I added about 4 or so drops of water to it and mixed it up. I put this everywhere the flesh wasn't, making sure to get it into those shadows, but wiping most of it away from the surface. For the base, I wanted to keep it simple, so I'm using a ripped up makeup sponge to dab some of the black and white together, to give it a subtle hint of texture. Then I went over it with red and a texture brush to create some bloody horror effects. And there's Moloch in all his glory, ready for battle. And I encourage you to paint and maybe play something that scares you a little bit. Boop. Happy painting!